In the quiet of a retirement home, Sam Carter, an African-American war veteran, spends his days in solitude, lost in the echoes of a past that still haunts him. His wife is gone, and with no children to visit, he feels the weight of his memories pressing down on him, isolating him from the world around him. His eyes often wander through the window, seeking comfort in the familiar landscape but finding only emptiness. He keeps to himself, speaking little and avoiding conversation, a man trying to bury the ghosts of war in silence. Meanwhile, Hans Mahler, a frail, elderly German man, lives his days with a quiet reserve. His face tells little of the horrors he once lived through as a soldier during World War II. He moves slowly through the halls of the retirement home, his steps careful and measured, as if every motion was weighed down by the burden of secrets he cannot share. He avoids talking about his past, choosing instead to focus on small, everyday tasks. The laughter and chatter around him seem distant, a world he no longer belongs to. His eyes are often clouded with regret, his heart still heavy with the choices he made so long ago. Both men, though sharing the same roof, remain strangers to each other, their paths rarely crossing except for the fleeting moments in the communal spaces. There is an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual avoidance of the past and the pain that accompanies it. They each, in their own way, try to outrun the ghosts of history, but in their quiet, parallel lives, they cannot escape the truth that the weight of their pasts will eventually bring them together. Their first real encounter happens one morning in the retirement home's common dining area. Sam, sitting alone at a table, slowly stirs his coffee, lost in thought. His eyes flicker to the door as Hans enters, walking with deliberate steps, his frail hands gripping the cane for support. The room is bustling with the chatter of other residents, but there's a tension in the air when Hans' gaze briefly meets Sam's. Both men, aware of the shared history that lies between them, exchange a moment of silent acknowledgement, yet neither is willing to break the ice. As Hans approaches the buffet, he accidentally bumps into Sam's chair, knocking over his coffee cup. The spill is small, but it's enough to break the silence. Sam looks up, his expression hardening for a split second, but he quickly masks it. Hans mutters an apology, his voice thick with an accent that Sam cannot ignore. A flicker of discomfort passes between them as Hans begins to bend down to clean the mess. Sam, though reluctant, offers a hand, his voice colder than he intends. "It's fine. Let's just clean it up." There's a pause before Hans stands up straight, meeting Sam's eyes for a brief moment. Sam feels the weight of the unspoken tension between them, but Hans, with a slight nod, accepts the offer. Their brief interaction is marked by awkwardness, but there's an undeniable curiosity in both men. As Hans walks away, Sam watches him, wondering about the man's past, about the years spent on the other side of a war that Sam knows all too well. Hans, too, feels the eyes of his fellow resident on him, but he keeps moving, his thoughts lingering on the man who, like him, has seen far too much. Over the next few days, the two men find themselves crossing paths more frequently. The retirement home's routines offer little variety, and both Sam and Hans seem to gravitate towards the same spaces: the library, the garden, and, inevitably, the dining room. At first, their encounters remain brief and tense, with only polite nods exchanged. But one afternoon, as Sam sits alone in the library, he notices Hans slowly making his way through the shelves, stopping to read the titles on the spines of the books. There's an air of hesitation about him, as though he's not quite sure where he belongs in this quiet world. Sam, who had been reading a novel for the past hour, finds himself growing increasingly curious. Without thinking too much about it, he sets his book down and speaks up. "You like history?" he asks, his voice low, almost uncertain. Hans glances up, clearly surprised. He hesitates before responding, his accent thick but clear. I've always found history complicated," he admits, his fingers brushing over the books as if searching for something. "Some parts of it are better left unread." Sam's gaze softens, sensing the weight in Hans' words. Yeah, I get that, he mutters, leaning back in his chair. The conversation lingers awkwardly for a moment, but then Hans, with a small sigh, sits down across from Sam, looking at the book in his hands. Do you read about war? Hans asks, a flicker of vulnerability in his voice. I try to forget about it, but sometimes it's hard. Sam looks at him for a long moment, then slowly nods. I've read a lot about it, he replies, his eyes distant. But it doesn't change anything. It's all just noise. Until you start to understand what it really cost. The weight of the conversation hangs between them, unspoken yet heavy. Neither man says much after that, but the silence feels different, more comfortable, as though they've crossed a threshold they hadn't anticipated. For the first time, they begin to see each other as something more than just symbols of opposing sides of a war. They are two men, burdened by their histories, seeking some kind of understanding, if not redemption. The connection, though fragile, has begun. As the days pass, Sam and Hans continue to find themselves in each other's presence, each encounter slowly building a bridge between them. One afternoon, after a quiet lunch, Hans and Sam end up sitting together on a bench in the garden. The conversation starts as it always does, with small talk about the weather, the flowers blooming, or the new activities at the retirement home. But gradually, the small talk fades, and something deeper begins to emerge. Hans, after a long pause, begins to share a memory, one of the few he's ever spoken of from his past. I lost a brother, he says softly, his gaze fixed on the ground. We were close, but I never saw him again after the war. I don't know what happened to him. I've spent years wondering if he made it out. Sam nods slowly, feeling a familiar ache deep within him. I lost people too, he says quietly. Friends. Brothers in arms. I never got to say goodbye. We were just thrown into it. No time to think about anything but surviving. He pauses, then adds, his voice thick with emotion, I never got to tell my wife how much I loved her. She died while I was overseas. We thought I'd have more time, but we never know when it'll be our turn. For a long moment, neither man speaks. The garden around them is quiet, the only sound being the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. They both sit, staring off into the distance, each lost in their own memories, but strangely united in their grief. It's in this silence that the true understanding between them begins to form, a recognition of the shared pain that both men have carried for years. Hans looks at Sam, his eyes a mix of sadness and gratitude. I never thought I'd meet someone like you here, he admits, his voice rough with emotion. Someone who understands what it's like to carry the weight of those memories. Sam looks back at Hans, his expression softened by the rawness of the moment. I never thought I'd find someone who understands either. But maybe that's what we're both doing here, trying to make sense of all the things we lost. In that moment, they realize that despite their vastly different pasts, their experiences are far more alike than they ever expected. Both have been shaped by war, by loss, and by the haunting questions that come with it. But more than that, they both share a need to find meaning in the lives they've lived, to find peace amidst the scars left behind. It's the beginning of something neither of them expected, an unlikely bond formed not out of history or circumstance, but from the simple shared human need for connection and understanding. As the days turn into weeks, Sam and Hans begin to spend more time together. What started as brief exchanges has grown into something more. Conversations that stretch well into the evening, shared moments of quiet understanding. They sit together on the same bench in the garden, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the books they've read or the small events happening in the retirement home. Sam teaches Hans how to use a smartphone, a small but significant step for someone who has lived so much of his life without the need for technology. In return, Hans shares stories of his childhood in Germany, of the small joys he experienced before the war took everything from him. One afternoon, Sam brings his old guitar to the garden, strumming softly as the sun begins to set. Hans, who has always enjoyed music but never played an instrument, watches with interest. You play? Hans asks, his voice tinged with curiosity. Sam looks up, a slight smile on his lips. I used to, he says, his fingers pausing on the strings. Before. Well, before everything changed. He shrugs, as if brushing off the weight of the past. Hans hesitates, then asks, "Could you teach me?" Sam looks at him surprised. "You want to learn?" Hans nods, a rare spark of eagerness in his eyes. "I never had the chance. But now, I think I would like to try." From that day on, they meet regularly in the garden, with Sam teaching Hans the basics of guitar playing. At first, Hans struggles with the chords, his hands trembling from years of age and the burden of time. But Sam is patient, showing him again and again, encouraging him with small words of praise. Over time, Hans grows more confident, and the two of them find a rhythm in their lessons, laughter and the soft strum of the guitar becoming a regular soundtrack to their days. As their friendship deepens, they begin to share more than just lessons and stories. They start to challenge each other. Sam, who has long closed himself off from the world, begins to open up about his experiences, talking about the horrors and the moments of humanity he encountered amidst the chaos. Hans listens, offering his own reflections from his past, sharing the guilt he's carried for his role in the war and the pain of knowing the lives his actions affected. Their bond is not built on simply forgetting the past but on confronting it together. They share their regrets, their mistakes, and their hopes for the future, however uncertain it may be. In their friendship, they find a space where the weight of history doesn't have to define them, where they can simply be two men trying to make sense of their lives after the turmoil. One evening, as they sit together after a long day, Sam looks at Hans with a soft smile. "I never thought I'd find someone like you here," he says quietly. "Someone who knows what it's like to live with all this." Hans, his fingers still resting on the guitar, nods slowly. "And I never thought I'd find a friend. Someone who can help me carry it all." Their friendship, built slowly and steadily, becomes a source of comfort and strength for both of them. What started as a tentative bridge between two men from opposing sides of history has grown into a deep, unbreakable bond, one forged in the shared understanding of loss, regret, and the need for connection. They no longer face the weight of their pasts alone. Together, they have found something worth holding on to in the twilight of their lives. One afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun filters through the windows of the retirement home, a sudden tension brews between Sam and Hans. They are sitting together in the lounge, talking about a documentary on World War II that was shown on the television in the common room. It starts off as a casual conversation, but as the subject grows more intense, so do their emotions. "I don't understand how anyone could just follow orders without questioning what they were doing," Sam says, his voice tight with frustration. "The atrocities. They were right there in front of you. How could anyone not see that?" Hans stiffens, his grip on his coffee cup tightening. "You think it was so simple," he snaps, his voice raised slightly. "We were told to fight for our country, for what we believed in. We didn't see ourselves as monsters. We were just soldiers, young men caught up in something much bigger than us." Sam's eyes flash with anger. "You knew what was happening. You knew the horrors the Nazis were committing. How could you not see that as wrong?" Hans looks away, his expression hardening. The mention of the Nazis seems to trigger something deep within him. "You don't understand," he says, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a boy when I was drafted. I didn't have a choice. We didn't get to choose who we fought for, or what we were told to do. We just followed orders." The room falls into a heavy silence, both men feeling the weight of their words. Hans stands up abruptly, walking to the window, his back turned to Sam. The anger that had flared between them now hangs in the air like a storm about to break. Sam watches him for a moment, his own chest tight with the same fury. But as the silence drags on, something shifts. The tension in Sam's body begins to dissipate, replaced by a quieter, more sorrowful understanding. He stands slowly, his movements careful, and walks toward Hans, who is staring out at the garden, lost in thought. "Hans, Sam begins, his voice softer now, filled with a quiet regret. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push you like that. Get it? Do. It wasn't simple for any of us. Hans turns around, his face lined with years of pain and experience. It wasn't, he murmurs. It never is. There's a long pause as both men stand, the weight of their pasts pressing down on them. Then, slowly, Hans speaks again, his voice gentler. I know it's hard to understand. But the choices we made, the things we did, they haunt me every day. I don't want to be that person anymore, Sam. I don't want to carry that guilt. Sam looks at him, his expression softer now. I know you don't. And I don't want to carry my ghosts either. He steps closer, his voice firm but understanding. We can't change the past, Hans. But we can choose what we do now. We're not those men anymore. Hans nods slowly, tears welling in his eyes. For the first time, Sam sees the vulnerability in him, the years of regret that he has kept buried. In that moment, the walls between them crumble, not because they've forgotten their histories, but because they've acknowledged them, together. I'm sorry, Hans says again, his voice thick. For everything. Sam places a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. We all did things we regret, Hans. But that's not who we are now. We've been through too much to let it define us. The two men stand there for a while, their shared silence speaking volumes. The conflict between them has been resolved not through anger or denial, but through the simple act of understanding. They have both come to terms with their pasts, not by erasing them, but by accepting them and choosing to move forward together. From that day on, their friendship is stronger than ever. They continue to spend their days in each other's company, knowing that while their pasts may never fully be erased, they now have something far more powerful, a bond forged in shared experiences and mutual respect, a friendship that transcends history. One crisp evening, as the air turns colder and the days grow shorter, Sam and Hans find themselves sitting side by side on their usual bench in the garden. The sky is painted with streaks of orange and pink as the sun dips below the horizon. The retirement home is quiet, the sounds of life outside muted by the stillness of the evening. Sam has been quieter than usual, lost in his thoughts, and Hans notices it immediately. You've been distant lately, Hans says softly, his voice carrying a note of concern. Is something wrong, Sam? Sam takes a long, deep breath, his eyes on the fading sky. For a moment he doesn't answer, but the heaviness in his chest is palpable. Finally he speaks, his voice strained, almost breaking. I've been thinking about my family. About how I never got the chance to tell them how much I loved them. My wife, my friends. They're all gone and it feels like I've lost everything that ever mattered. All the things I did, fighting, surviving, it doesn't feel like it was worth it. Not anymore. Hans listens intently, sensing the deep pain behind Sam's words. His own heart aches as he watches his friend struggle with the weight of his grief. He's known loss, regret, and guilt, but seeing Sam so vulnerable brings a depth to the pain he can hardly put into words. I understand, Sam, Hans says quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I understand more than you know. I've spent my entire life haunted by the choices I made in the war, the people I hurt, the lives I destroyed. But the hardest part is wondering if I'll ever be forgiven. I've lived with that question for so long, and I don't know if I'll ever find peace. Sam's eyes meet Hans now, their gazes locked in an unspoken understanding. We're both just trying to survive, aren't we? Sam says, his voice trembling. Just trying to find a way to make sense of everything we've lost. Hans nods slowly, his eyes moist with unshed tears. Surviving. That's what we've been doing all these years. But maybe, just maybe, we've found something worth living for again. This friendship. It's the one thing I didn't expect, and yet it's the only thing that feels real. A single tear falls down Sam's cheek, and Hans reaches out, placing a hand on his shoulder in a rare moment of comfort. The two men sit there, side by side, as the world around them fades into the night. There is no need for words anymore. In that quiet, shared moment, they both realize that their bond has transcended everything they've been through. It's a bond forged in pain, yes, but also in healing. It's a bond that, in the end, might just be the very thing that saves them both. For the first time in a long while, Sam allows himself to believe in the possibility of peace. And for the first time in decades, Hans feels the weight of his past lift, if only a little. Together, they've found something greater than survival. They've found a friendship that gives meaning to the rest of their lives. And in that moment, under the vast, dark sky, they both feel a sense of hope, fragile but real, for the first time in years. As the days go by, the bond between Sam and Hans only deepens. The once tentative connection between them has evolved into a quiet but steadfast friendship. They spend their mornings together, sitting in the garden, talking about everything and nothing. Some days they play music, Hans with his newly learned guitar, Sam tapping his fingers on the table in rhythm, both lost in the simplicity of the moment. Other days they share stories, their voices steady but rich with the weight of years. And sometimes, when the silence stretches between them, they are content simply in each other's company, knowing they no longer carry their burdens alone. In the evening, as the retirement home prepares for another quiet night, Sam and Hans walk together along the paths they've come to know so well. The night air is cool but comfortable, and the stars above twinkle with quiet brilliance. Sam looks up at the sky, the vastness of it filling him with a sense of peace he hasn't known in years. "You know," Sam says quietly, "I never thought I'd be here, at this point in my life. I thought I'd never find peace. But maybe I've found it after all." Hans, walking beside him, nods slowly, his face soft with the understanding of someone who has seen the darkness and has finally stepped into the light. "We've been through a lot, Sam," he says, his voice thoughtful. "But I think we're still here because there's something more waiting for us. Something better." The two men stop for a moment, standing side by side, watching the stars. For a long while, there are no words between them, just the quiet hum of life around them, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. And in that silence, there's a deep, unspoken understanding that they've both found something precious, a friendship that has brought them back to life, a bond that has given them new hope, new purpose. As they continue their walk, they share a small, knowing smile. They don't have all the answers, and they don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in years, they are no longer afraid. The past is behind them, and though it will never fully fade, it no longer defines them. They have discovered something more powerful than the weight of their memories, each other. Together they walk toward the future, a future that, while uncertain, is now full of possibility. The world around them may be filled with shadows, but in this quiet corner of it, they have found their light. And with that, they move forward. Two old men no longer defined by their pasts, but by the strength of their bond and the hope that tomorrow might just be a little brighter than yesterday.